The wind howled through the canyon like a living thing, biting and relentless. What began as a simple act of kindness was about to trap Boone Cartwright in a situation no amount of gunfighting could resolve. Yet when he saw her there, half buried in snow and barely clinging to life, all he could see was a girl dying, everything else the danger, the risk, the rules of the frontier melted away under the storm that had been building since dawn, turning the narrow mountain pass into a white, frozen wasteland. Boone tugged his coat tighter as his horse trudged forward, hooves sinking into the deepening drifts. He'd been riding hard for 3 days, pushing toward the trading post, hoping to get there before the weather worsened. The cold gnawed at him, sharp and merciless, seeping through his gloves until his fingers ached. Then he saw it, a shape, slumped against a boulder up ahead, still and small. At first he thought it might be some half-buried animal, seeking shelter, but as he drew closer, the form became unmistakably human. A girl, Apache, no older than 19, curled up in a thin, deer-hide dress that did nothing to stop the cold. Her lips were blue, her limbs trembling uncontrollably. She was slipping away, fast. Boone dismounted without a thought. He knew the signs of death when he saw them. The girl's eyes fluttered open, dark, deep, intelligent. There was no fear in them, only quiet resignation. She was beautiful in a way that stopped his breath, but right now, none of that mattered. She was dying. He remembered the saloon stories, the warnings, the violence that came when Apache and settlers crossed paths, the blood spilled on both sides. He remembered the old rules, the unspoken ones that said helping the wrong person could be a death sentence. But standing there in the snow, none of that mattered. He reached into his bedroll and pulled out his most prized possession, his grandmother's blanket. Thick wool, faded blue and gray, soft from years of use, but still heavy with warmth. It had kept him alive through countless bitter nights, his only heirloom. He didn't hesitate. He wrapped it around her shivering body and knelt beside her. She looked up at him, surprised, as if kindness from a white man was the last thing she expected. Her fingers, stiff and blue, clutched at the blanket like a lifeline. "You'll be all right," he murmured, even though he wasn't sure she could understand him. Her breathing steadied, color returned to her cheeks. She kept her eyes locked on his, as if searching his face for answers to questions she couldn't ask. Something passed between them in that silence, something neither of them could name. He guided her behind the rocks, shielding her from the worst of the wind, built a small fire with what little dry kindling he had left, shared the last of his trail food. She pointed to herself and said softly, "Ayanna." She never stopped watching him, like she was committing his face to memory. They sat together, wrapped in warmth and silence, the storm raging around them. Boone didn't ask questions, how she'd ended up alone, where her people were. Those could wait. By morning, the snow had eased and Ayanna stood. She carefully folded the blanket and held it out to him. He shook his head. The storm had passed, and he still had his coat. She needed the warmth more than he did. She looked stunned by his refusal. Her voice rose as she spoke in rapid Apache, her gestures frantic, pointing at the blanket, at herself, then at him. There was something urgent in her tone, but Boone couldn't understand her words. He simply smiled, tipped his hat, and mounted up. "Keep warm," he said as he rode away, thinking that was the end of it. But Ayanna stood watching long after he vanished into the mist, clutching the blanket to her chest. In her world, what had just happened meant something very different than what Boone Cartwright understood. And before nightfall, her people would come seeking answers that could change both of their lives forever. He reached the trading post by mid-afternoon, his mind still wrapped around the girl's dark eyes and that moment of connection. He couldn't shake the feeling she'd been trying to warn him. The post sat low in a pine-sheltered valley, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, the fire roared and 3 men nursed drinks over a card game. Murphy, the grizzled old trader, looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Boone Cartwright," he said, surprised. "Didn't think we'd see you till spring. Storm nearly killed my horses," Boone said, unbuttoning his coat. "Got business in Santa Fe that can't wait." Murphy handed him a tin cup of coffee. Boone wrapped his frozen hands around it, letting the heat seep into his bones. Still, his mind drifted back to Ayanna, her eyes, the urgency in her voice. "See any trouble on the trail?" asked one of the card players. A skinny man with a jagged scar across his jaw. "Nothing I couldn't handle," Boone replied carefully. He considered mentioning Ayanna, but something stopped him. These men wouldn't understand. They'd see only the danger, not the dying girl in the snow. "You're lucky," the scarred man muttered. "Apache hit a wagon train, not 20 miles south, left nothing but bones and buzzards." He spat in the corner. "Animals." The word made Boone's jaw clench. He remembered Ayanna's soft voice, the way she'd looked at him as he turned. Down the blanket, whatever those raiders had done, she hadn't been part of it. "You can bunk here," Murphy offered. "Room in the back, but I'd ride out at first light if I were you. Been hearing drums in the hills. You know what that means." As if on cue, the low, steady beat of drums drifted into the valley slow, rhythmic, like a heart pounding through the earth. The card game stopped. Every man turned toward the window. "There it is again," whispered the scarred man. "Been goin' since last night." Boone set down his cup, a cold knot twisted in his stomach. The sound wasn't random. It was communication measured, intentional. Something was happening. He took the offered bunk, but sleep refused him. The drums grew louder, closer, in their rhythm. He could almost hear his name. Shadows passed outside the window, slow and deliberate. Someone was looking for him. At dawn, silence returned, a silence so complete, even the birds held their breath. Boone dressed quickly and stepped out into the cold. His horse shifted nervously. Murphy stood nearby, rifle in hand. "They're out there," he said quietly, "watching. I can feel it." Boone nodded. He saddled up with calm precision. "I'm riding out." "You're insane," said the scarred man. "They'll cut you down before you reach the ridge." But Boone was already in the saddle. He wasn't going to wait to be hunted. He rode into the mist, hands open, weaponless. His horse's hooves echoed against stone as he climbed. Then they appeared 7 Apache warriors, silent and still, stepping from the trees like spirits. Their horses were painted for war, their faces unreadable. One raised a hand. Boone stopped. The older warrior stepped forward, his beaded shirt glinting in the morning light. His voice carried power, echoing off the canyon walls. Behind him, the others stood like carved statues. Then another figure stepped from behind them. Ayanna. She wore the same dress, but Boone's blue and gray blanket was now draped across her shoulders, like a ceremonial shroud. Her eyes met his and he saw not fear or gratitude, but gravity. "Consequence." The elder spoke again. Ayanna translated, her voice low but steady. "My grandfather says, you have claimed me as your wife." Boone's stomach dropped. "What? I never. That was just the blanket." Ayanna kept translating. "When a man gives a woman his blanket, he vows to protect and provide for her. That is our way." Boone stared at the blanket, his grandmother's gift, now a symbol of something sacred. "That wasn't my intent," he said, desperate. "I was just trying to save your life." Ayanna's voice trembled now. "Intentions matter less than actions. You saved me. You gave me your warmth. You claimed me. Now, you must honor it." The canyon walls pressed in. Boone could hardly breathe. Every pair of eyes was on him. "I don't understand your ways," he said, voice hoarse. "Where I come from, it just means you don't want someone to die." The old man listened, then spoke again. Ayanna translated slowly. "He asks, would you have done the same for an Apache man?" The question hit like a gunshot. Would he? Would he have stopped, risked warmth, risked his life? Probably not. He admitted it aloud. "No." The elder nodded, unsurprised. "You saw me as a woman first," Ayanna translated. "Apache second." The truth hung in the air like breath on winter wind. And now it demanded a price. "This shows honor," Ayanna translated, her voice barely louder than the wind curling through the canyon. "But honor carries responsibility." One of the younger warriors shifted on his horse, hand resting with intention on the hilt of his weapon. Boone saw its small movement. Big message and sweat began to slide down his back despite the cold. These men weren't just here to talk. This wasn't a peaceful parley. They were here to uphold their laws, their customs, no matter the cost. Boone's voice was steady, but low. What happens if I refuse? Deep down, he already knew the answer. Ayanna hesitated before translating. Her face changed as the Apache men began speaking rapidly to one another. Several voices entered the conversation, overlapping in heated bursts. Boone couldn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. He read the hard lines in their faces, the clipped gestures, the grim tension hanging in the air. When they finally fell silent, Ayanna looked pale, shaken. "If you refuse," she said slowly, carefully picking her words, "you dishonor not just me, but my family. My grandfather would be obligated to—" She paused, struggling for the right term in English, "to restore our honor through blood." The air around Boone seemed to thin. That unspoken threat hung there like smoke from a funeral pyre. He looked at each warrior in turn. There was no room for mercy in their eyes, no bluff, just truth, and the resolve to follow it to the bitter end. But then he turned to Ayanna, really looked at her. She stood tall, chin lifted, shoulders squared, but her eyes, those intelligent, watchful eyes, held a kind of fear that wasn't just for herself. She was afraid for him, afraid of what might happen if one wrong word was spoken, if one step strayed, afraid of what her people might be forced to do, and what the cost would be if they did. She stood between two worlds, one foot in each, and neither offering peace. If you were Boone, what would you do? Accept a marriage to save your life and risk trapping a young woman in something she didn't ask for? Or refuse and spark bloodshed that might destroy both of you? Tell me in the comments. I want to know which side you'd choose, because what Boone Cartwright decided next would shape more than just his future. It would determine the fate of everyone. Standing in that silent, wind-carved canyon, "There has to be another way," Boone said finally, voice steady but cautious. "Some trial or test I can face instead." The elder Naunish raised an eyebrow, a small flicker of surprise breaking through his otherwise stone-like demeanor. He replied in Apache. Ayanna blinked, startled by the words, and then turned to Boone. "He says, you speak like a warrior, not a coward. This is unexpected." Another pause. "He will consider your words, but first you must come to our village. You must understand what you are truly choosing." From behind Naunish, the younger warrior, the one whose hand had rested so eagerly on his weapon, spoke sharply. His tone held no patience, no trust. His voice was thick with protest. Naunish silenced him with a single command. His look said more than words. It was not a suggestion. "My cousin," Ayanna explained quietly, "believes you should choose now, that if you are given time, you will run." Boone didn't flinch. He turned toward the hostile young man, met his stare with a quiet steel of his own. He saw the heat there, the hair-trigger readiness for violence. If there was even a hint of cowardice in Boone's next move, the canyon floor would run red. "I give you my word," Boone said, speaking directly to Naunish. "I won't run." As Ayanna translated, Boone felt the weight of what he'd just promised. This wasn't just about a marriage anymore. He'd agreed to step into an Apache village, into their world, their rules, their judgment. A place where he'd be surrounded by people who had every reason to hate him. People who remembered every wrong his people had ever done. He wasn't just risking his life. Somehow, without even realizing it, he'd taken responsibility for Ayanna's as well. The journey deeper into the mountains was long and steep, the trail narrow and winding. The village revealed itself only at the last moment. A hidden oasis tucked in a valley between towering red cliffs. Boone stared as it emerged from the landscape, like a ghost given form. It was larger than he'd imagined. Dozens of traditional lodges spread along a sparkling stream, smoke rising in lazy spirals, children's laughter echoing faintly in the crisp air. But as their group rode in, the laughter stopped. Faces turned. Men, women, elders, children. Every pair of eyes fixed on the stranger riding among their warriors. Some looks were curious, cautious, others cold, flat, openly hostile. Boone felt exposed, like a wolf in a lamb's pasture. Except he wasn't sure who the real predator was. Here, Naunish led the group to a large communal fire pit at the center of the village. A wide circle of logs surrounded it, clearly a place of ceremony. From the largest lodge, an elderly woman emerged, Her hair was braided and laced with turquoise. Her posture was regal. Her eyes, sharp as arrowheads, locked onto Boone like she was reading every sin he'd ever committed. Ayanna stood beside him. "My grandmother," she said softly, "Imala. She is not pleased." That was an understatement. Imala spoke quickly and sharply to Nalnish, her tone cutting, her gestures aimed like blades. Several villagers began gathering near the fire. The crowd grew quickly, curious whispers blending with angered muttering. The air began to shift. "What's she saying?" Boone asked, glancing sideways. Ayanna's face flushed. "She says, you smell like whiskey and violence. That bringing you here puts the entire village in danger." Her voice faltered. "She says, I have brought shame on our family by accepting gifts from a stranger." The crowd murmured louder. One voice rose above the rest, a young man pushing his way to the front. His tone was heated. His words fired like arrows at Ayanna. She shook her head in protest, but he wouldn't stop. "Who is he?" Boone asked. The jealousy burning in the man's eyes gave away the answer. "Kirik," she whispered. "He's asked for my hand many times." Her voice dropped. "He says this is all a trick, that I made up the blanket story to avoid marrying him." Kirik stepped closer. His hand brushed the hilt of a knife. "You take what is not yours." He growled in accented but clear English. "White man, leave now, or I cut out your lying tongue." The threat cracked across the crowd like lightning. Boone didn't move. "I didn't take anything," he said evenly. "I gave something." "There's a difference." Kirik's face twisted with rage. "You gave nothing. You trick sacred custom for your pleasure. Then you run." Before Boone could answer, Imala stepped forward and thrust herself between the two men. She shouted at Kirik, and he backed away reluctantly, but his eyes never left Boone. Then Imala turned to Ayanna, her voice weighted with disappointment. She didn't shout this time. That made it worse. Ayanna's shoulders wilted beneath the burden of her grandmother's words. When Imala finished, Ayanna turned away, eyes shining. "She says I must choose," she whispered. "Either prove that your intentions are honorable by completing the marriage trials, or admit that I was a fool and accept Kirik's proposal instead." Boone stared at her. "The marriage trials." His stomach sank. "What kind of trials?" "3. Ayanna said, standing straighter now. "Strength, wisdom, sacrifice. If you fail any one of them," she didn't finish. "She didn't need." 2. The faces surrounding them told the rest of the story. Boone could see the hope on a few, but most were eager to see him fail. Nalnish spoke again, and the crowd silenced instantly. His voice rang like iron on stone. "The trials begin at sunset," Ayanna translated, her voice hardening. "And if you run before they are finished, Kirik has permission to hunt you down." Boone scanned the crowd. Some people hoped, others hated. But Ayanna, in her expression, was the only answer he needed. Despite everything, she was still the girl shivering under his grandmother's blanket, still the one who looked at him like he was more than what the world made of him. "She's worth it," Boone told himself, "even if I don't fully understand why." He squared his shoulders and looked to Nalnish. "Then I guess we'd better get started." The sun dipped behind the canyon walls, bathing the village in molten gold as torches were lit. The central fire roared. Shadows danced against redstone cliffs, turning the scene into something older than time. Boone stood on the outer edge of the ring, eyes fixed on Nalnish, who approached with 3 objects in his hands: a coiled rope, a carved block of wood, and a leather pouch that rattled with mystery. He set them by the fire. "The first trial tests your strength," Ayanna whispered. "You must climb the sacred cliff face. Use only the rope. Reach the eagle's nest and bring back a feather." Boone turned toward the towering rock face behind the village. It stretched skyward, cruel and sheer, with barely any visible handholds. The nest was just a dark blot near the top, some 60 feet up. "Even our own warriors fail," Ayanna warned. "Some have died." Kirik stepped forward, mocking the task in their native tongue, his contempt thick and loud. Ayanna translated. "He says you will fall like a stone, that your soft hands have held only whiskey bottles." Boone didn't answer. He pulled off his coat and hat, the cold biting immediately. The rope was rough, frayed in places. He tested it. then began to climb. The first stretch was manageable. His muscles burned, but he was used to hard work. His hands bled, but he kept going. Then halfway up, the rock beneath his boots crumbled, and he swung out, dangling in open space. Gasps below, a cry of Yana's. Pain flared through his shoulders. He gritted his teeth, found new holds, and pulled upward. Near the top, an eagle burst from the nest screeching, furious, slashing at him with talons that tore across his shoulder. Blood soaked his shirt, but in the nest, tangled in sharp sticks, lay one perfect feather. He grabbed it and began the descent. Every inch hurt, but he made it. His knees hit earth, and the crowd murmured in awe. Even Kirik looked shaken. Boone held up the feather. Nalnish examined it, nodded, and spoke. "The eagle fought you," Ayana said with trembling pride. "But you did not give in. The first trial is complete." Boone barely had time to breathe before Nalnish held up the carved wooden block. Symbols glowed in the firelight like shifting spirits. "The second trial," Ayana said quietly, "tests your wisdom. You must solve the riddle of the ancestor stone before the fire burns to embers." Boone stared at the symbols. The fire behind him crackled, already eating through its fuel. "What happens if I fail?" he asked. Ayana swallowed. "Then you have failed to trials." She didn't say the rest, but he could see it written across Kiruk's face. The answer, final and merciless. Failure meant death, and with each second, success felt further out of reach. Boone stared at the ancestor stone, its surface carved with symbols that might as well have been etched by ghosts. The shapes mocked him with their mystery, twisting and curling like secrets only time understood. He turned the heavy piece over in his bleeding hands, his fingertips tracing the lines as if they might whisper a clue, but they remained silent. Around him, the fire crackled lower, its dying sparks floating upward, each one a countdown toward failure. Whispers slithered through the villagers surrounding the fire. Some were murmurs of curiosity, others low hums of pity, but more than a few carried a quiet finality, as if Boone's defeat was no longer a question, but an expectation. The carved symbols danced in the dim light. There were animals: a bear, an eagle, a serpent. Natural features appeared: 2 mountains, rivers, the sun and moon. But how they fit together, what story they told, remained as unscalable as the cliff he'd just conquered. How do you solve a riddle? Boone thought grimly. When you don't even understand the language it's written in. Can you give me a hint? He asked Ayana, desperation sharpening the edge of his voice. She shook her head, her expression heavy with sorrow. "The wisdom trial must be completed alone," she said. "To help you would dishonor both of us." From across the fire, Kiruk's voice rang out, smug and cutting. Boone didn't need a translation. The tone said it all. He was already counting his victory. Several villagers nodded in agreement. Watching the fire shrink lower, Boone forced himself to think differently. He couldn't crack the language, but maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe the symbols weren't meant to be deciphered like words, but understood like stories. Every culture had stories, shared patterns, truths that crossed time and place. He looked again, really looked. The spiral in the center of the stone wasn't random. It resembled the cycle of seasons. Around it, the animals took their places: bear where the sun would be in summer, eagle at the position of spring, snake curled at autumn's edge. His lips parted. "Seasons." He murmured, "It's about the seasons." But it couldn't be just that. Not with the human figure at the center of the spiral, arms outstretched, lines radiating from its body to each animal. Suddenly it struck him. The answer wasn't simply what the symbols meant, but what they meant to the people. It wasn't just seasons. It was the relationship between people and nature across time. The bear for summer, when the Apache hunted and stored food to prepare for lean months. The eagle for spring, when they built, renewed, soared with strength. The snake for autumn, shedding old skin, old ways, to prepare for the cold. And winter. Boone's eyes settled on the final symbol, one he'd overlooked. Not an animal, but a blanket, or a shelter. Warmth when the world turned cold. His heart pounded. This wasn't a riddle about translation. It was a question about who he was. "The riddle isn't asking what the symbols mean," Boone said aloud, standing slowly, the firelight flickering across his face. "It's asking why I'm here." He lifted the stone, showing it to Nalnish, and the others gathered around. His voice rang with clarity now, with conviction. Each symbol is a choice. The bear taking by force what you think you're owed. The eagle rising above others' suffering. The snake slipping away from your responsibilities when times get hard. He turned toward Ayanna, meeting her gaze, and the blanket. That's the choice, to give warmth, to offer something of yourself, even when it costs you. The fire had nearly died, glowing faintly like coals beneath ash. Nalnish raised a hand, stopping the trial. He spoke rapidly, and Ayanna blinked in stunned surprise before translating. He says, "You understand that wisdom isn't about knowing our symbols, it's about knowing yourself." Her voice trembled. The ancestor stone shows the four paths a man can take when faced with another's suffering. You chose the path of the blanket. A ripple of awe passed through the villagers. Even Kuruk's eyes widened with reluctant respect. But Nalnish wasn't finished. He spoke again, and this time his voice carried weight that made the silence around it absolute. "The second trial is complete," Ayanna said, almost breathless. "But my grandfather says the third trial is the most dangerous. It tests not your body or your mind but your heart." Nalnish reached for the leather pouch. The soft clink of bones inside echoed like a warning through the firelight. When he spilled them onto the ground, they scattered like dice of fate's maul. Pale finger bones etched with more ancient symbols. "The trial of sacrifice," Ayanna whispered, her breath misting in the chill air. "You must choose what you're willing to lose to gain what you claim to want." Boone's pulse slowed to a drumbeat. The first two trials had tested pain, strength, clarity of thought. But this would test something deeper, something raw and buried. As Nalnish studied the pattern the bones had formed, his gaze was sharp and unblinking. It felt like he was reading not the bones but Boone's soul. The village stood still, watching, holding its breath. Then Nalnish spoke, and the words fell like stones. "The bones have chosen the sacrifice," Ayanna translated softly. "You must give up the thing you value most in this world. Only then can you claim what you seek." Boone felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. "What if I don't know what that is?" he asked. Nalnish's answer came with a grim smile. He gestured to Boone's horse, still saddled at the edge of the village, then to the gun, belt around his waist, and finally to the folded, worn photograph tucked inside Boone's shirt. "A picture of his parents. He says, 'A man always knows,'" Ayanna whispered. "The bones reveal what you try to hide from yourself." Kuruk stepped forward again, his tone mocking, his words fast and scornful. Other villagers murmured in agreement, clearly siding with him. "My cousin says this is foolishness," Ayanna said, her voice tightening. "He says no white man would ever give up anything real for an Apache woman. He believes you will leave rather than sacrifice." Boone looked down at the three things Nalnish had pointed to. His horse freedom, the power to go anywhere, be anyone, his gun safety, control in a hostile world. The photograph, his past, his family, his roots. He breathed in deeply, but something inside him had shifted. Those things, the things he once clung to with all his strength, suddenly felt distant, smaller. The horse was just a horse, the gun, just a tool. Even the photograph, as sacred as it had once felt, it was just a memory, and the people in it were already gone. But Ayanna wasn't. She was here, alive, waiting, a part of a life that hadn't been written yet. "I know what I have to sacrifice," Boone said quietly. He reached inside his shirt and pulled out the photograph. The faces of his parents looked back at him, frozen. In time, his father's stoic expression, his mother's warm smile. This image had been his compass for years, but to keep looking back was to keep walking in circles. He'd never find the future that way. He walked to the fire pit and knelt. "I sacrifice my old life," he said. "The man I was, the world I came from, the things I thought I needed to hold on to." He laid the photograph gently in the embers. It caught immediately. Flames licked the paper, curling it inward as the faces disappeared in ash and smoke. The heat bit at his hands, but Boone didn't move, didn't flinch. The village erupted in whispers, gasps. Even Kuruk stood frozen. But it was Ayanna's face that he watched. Wonder bloomed there, and something deeper. Something soft and radiant and blooming like hope. Nalnish stepped forward, his voice now touched with a depth of respect Boone hadn't yet heard. He says, "Ayana translated through tears, you have proven yourself worthy, not because you completed the trials, but because you understood what they truly meant." Her voice trembled with joy. Strength without wisdom is useless. Wisdom without sacrifice is meaningless. From the shadows, Imala emerged. The same stern elder who had once condemned him now walked toward Boone with something in her hands. A new shirt made of soft deerskin and decorated with precise, intricate beadwork. She spoke softly. "She says, 'Welcome to the family.'" Ayana whispered. Boone pulled the shirt over his shoulders, the fabric warm against his raw skin. Something inside him shifted. The cowboy who had entered the canyon that morning had died somewhere along the way. In his place stood someone new, someone who had chosen love over freedom, connection over escape, the future over the past. Kirik approached, his pride bruised, but his heart changed. He looked Boone in the eye and spoke in English. "You fight like Apache," he said simply. She chose well. Round them, the village began to celebrate. Fires danced, music stirred, voices lifted. Joy blossomed like wildflowers across the canyon. Boone turned to Ayana, took her hand. The same blanket he'd given her his grandmother's was still draped across her shoulders. But now, it wasn't just protection from the cold. It was a promise, a symbol, a choice. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice small beneath the rising sounds of celebration. "Giving up your old life?" Boone looked into her eyes, deep, dark, beautiful, and saw the rest of his story there. "It's not the life I planned," he said, pulling her closer. "But it's the life I chose." He paused. "And the only thing I regret." He smiled, brushing her hair back from her cheek, "is that it took me so long to understand what that blanket really meant. Tomorrow, there would be challenges, learning the language, earning trust, becoming part of a people he once knew nothing about, building a marriage not from circumstance, but respect." But tonight, with Ayana's fingers wrapped in his, and the old blanket wrapped around both of them, Boone felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt home.